All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling a philosophical heavyweight, Al-Ghazali, and his masterpiece, The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
This book, it really shook things up in the Islamic world. And what's fascinating is that Al-Ghazali wasn't just some random critic. He was a major scholar, a respected theologian in his own right.
Yeah, taking on the intellectual giants of his time. It's like
Okay.
David versus Goliath, but with ideas instead of, slingshots.
Exactly. He was going up against thinkers like Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi, these guys who were all about using reason, logic, to try and understand even the most complex theological ideas. But here's the twist. Al-Ghazali, he was a master logician himself.
So he could play their game. But he was worried that reason, when you apply it to, like, the divine, it could lead you down some pretty shaky paths.
That's the heart of it, yeah. He was deeply concerned about where that line of thinking might lead.
Okay, so let's break down his critique. Al-Ghazali, he had three major issues with the way these philosophers were using reason. He lays it all out in The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
Right, he goes point by point, taking them to task.
And first up, we've got this idea of the eternity of the world. The philosophers, they were following the lead of thinkers like Aristotle, proposing that the universe has always existed.
Right, alongside God. No beginning, no creation event, just always there.
And that bumps right up against traditional Islamic teachings, right?
Head-on collision. In Islam, God is the all-powerful creator. He brings the universe into being from absolutely nothing.
And that act of creation, that's central to Islamic thought. It emphasizes God's power, his will.
It puts God in the driver's seat, actively shaping everything.
So if the universe is just eternally there, where does that leave God's role as the creator?
It's a huge problem theologically. And Al-Ghazali, he brilliantly uses their own tools, reason and logic, to dismantle this whole idea of an eternal universe.
He's like, okay, you want to talk reason? Let's talk reason. Makes you wonder what these philosophers were thinking. Did they not see this coming?
Well, it was a complex time. There was a lot of intellectual ferment, a lot of trying to reconcile Greek thought with Islamic beliefs.
A lot of new ideas swirling around.
And sometimes, yeah, maybe some things got overlooked, or maybe, just maybe, they thought they had answers that could bridge that gap.
All right, so we've got this clash between the philosophers saying the universe is eternal and Al-Ghazali saying, nope, creation from nothing. What's the next big critique?
Next up, we get into the nature of God's knowledge. Some philosophers, and again, they're drawing on Greek thought here, they propose that God's knowledge might be limited. Like maybe God knows universal principles, the big picture stuff.
The laws of physics, but maybe not. Like what I'm going to have for lunch today.
Right. Or every leaf that falls from a tree,
Yeah.
They argued that being bogged down in the tiny details of the world, it would diminish God's grandeur somehow.
So God's got bigger fish to fry than knowing what's going on in my head. That's a bit of a mind bender.
It is. But for Al-Ghazali, this was a major departure from Islamic teachings. God's omniscience, to him, means knowing everything. No exceptions, no limits.
So even my most embarrassing thoughts, God's aware of those.
Let's just say Al-Ghazali believed in a God who is intimately involved in his creation, aware of every detail, every fluctuation. And this, by the way, has big implications for how we think about ethics, too.
Right. If God knows everything I do, it kind of raises the stakes in terms of how I live my life.
It definitely adds a new dimension to things.
Okay, on to critique number 3. We've got this question of bodily resurrection. What was the philosophical take on that?
Well, remember how some philosophers were influenced by Plato? And Plato, he believed that the soul, that's the immortal part, the real you, the body is just temporary like a shell.
So when we die, it's like shedding an old coat. Our soul keeps going, but the body stays behind?
Exactly. And some philosophers, they took this concept and applied it to the idea of resurrection. They thought of it more symbolically. Focus on the soul, not so much the physical body.
But in Islam, bodily resurrection, that's a big deal, right? It's not just some metaphorical thing.
Absolutely central. It's key to Islamic teachings about the afterlife, about the day of judgment. The idea is, on that final day, we are resurrected, body and soul. And all our actions, everything we've done in this life, it's all weighed, judged.
So Al-Ghazali, he felt that the philosophers, with their symbolic interpretation, they were messing with a core Islamic belief.
He saw it as potentially undermining the idea of divine justice. If there's no bodily resurrection, how can we truly be held accountable for what we do in this life?
Okay, so to recap, we've got these 3 big points of contention. Eternity of the world, the nature of God's knowledge, and this downplaying of bodily resurrection.
And Al-Ghazali, he sees them all as problematic, not just from an Islamic point of view, but philosophically too.
And he doesn't just dismiss these philosophical ideas. He engages with them, tries to dismantle them using reason and logic.
He picks their arguments apart, exposes their assumptions. It's a pretty masterful takedown.
So it's like he's saying, if you're going to use reason, let's use it properly. Let's see where it really leads. But there's more to this story, right? It's not just about abstract ideas.
Right, it gets personal. Al-Ghazali's critique, it's deeply intertwined with his own life, his own struggles and experiences.
Okay, before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, let's take a quick detour into Al-Ghazali's personal story, because it adds another layer to all of this.
Oh, it's crucial, really, because before he became this fierce critic, he went through this intense period of doubt, a spiritual crisis that completely transformed him.
So before he was taking on the philosophers, he was kind of wrestling with these big questions himself.
He was, and trust me, this is where things get really interesting. Because before he became the critic of philosophers, he was actually deeply immersed in philosophy himself.
He was like a philosophy fanboy.
More than that, he was a star scholar, teaching at the most prestigious madrasa in Baghdad, the Nizamiya. That was the intellectual hub of the Islamic world.
He was a rock star academic, basically.
He had it all: fame, respect, intellectual brilliance. But something was brewing beneath the surface. He started having these doubts, questioning everything, the nature of truth, the limits of human knowledge.
Like all that intellectual firepower wasn't giving him the answers he was looking for.
It just wasn't enough. And it led him to this incredible turning point.
So he reached a point where reason just wasn't cutting it. What happened next? Did he have some kind of epiphany?
Well, it wasn't a sudden thing, more like a process. This prolonged period of inner turmoil, a spiritual crisis that some even say manifested physically.
Wow, so this was more than just an intellectual exercise for him. It was deeply personal.
It was. His whole world was being shaken up. And so he made a radical decision. He walked away from it all. His position, his comfortable life, his intellectual pursuits, hit the pause button on his whole existence.
Welcome back to our deep dive on Al-Ghazali's The Incoherence of the Philosophers. Last time, we left him at a crossroads. He'd walked away from this amazing career grappling with these huge existential questions. Yeah, like he needed to step outside the whole world of logic and reason to really understand their limits. So what happened during this self-imposed exile? Did he just go off and live as a hermit, contemplating the meaning of life?
Well, not exactly a hermit. He did spend time in seclusion, but he also traveled a lot, immersed himself in Sufi practices, really delved into that mystical dimension of Islam.
Ah, so that's where the Sufi influence comes in.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like heady intellectual debates. He was looking for a direct experience of the divine.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about thinking about God. It was about experiencing God. And this, I think, is what makes his story so much richer than just some dry philosophical treatise.
It adds a human element to it. So this experience, did it change his whole perspective when he went back to writing and teaching?
It totally transformed him. When you read The Incoherence of the Philosophers, you can feel that intensity, that conviction. He's not just arguing. He's speaking from a place of deep personal transformation.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of Al-Ghazali's personal journey. Let's get back into the specifics of his philosophical critique. We talked about those three main areas where he clashed with the philosophers: the eternity of the world, God's knowledge, and bodily resurrection. Let's unpack those a bit more, starting with the eternity of the world.
All right, so picture those Greek philosophers, Aristotle in particular. They were all about observing the natural world, looking for patterns, trying to come up with explanations. And one thing they observed, is that the universe seems to operate according to these unchanging laws, these eternal principles. Pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah, it's like this underlying order, this sense that there's a blueprint to the whole thing.
Exactly. And for philosophers like Ibn Sina, who was hugely influenced by Aristotle, this idea of eternal laws, it fit perfectly with their concept of God. They saw God as this eternal, unchanging being.
So an eternal God creates an eternal universe. Seems logical.
Right, it has a symmetry to it. But here's where the clash comes in. Because in Islam, God isn't just eternal. He's also the all-powerful creator who brings the universe into being from nothing. There's a clear beginning, a moment of creation, and that's crucial in Islamic thought.
It emphasizes God's agency, his power to create.
Exactly. It's not just that the universe exists, it's that God willed it into existence. And for Al-Ghazali to say the universe is eternal, well, that wasn't just a theological error, it was a philosophical one too. He argued that the whole concept of an infinite past with no starting point, it just doesn't make sense logically.
Wait, how can an infinite past be illogical? Does an infinite mean it goes on forever?
That's what we tend to think. But Al-Ghazali, he gets into some really deep arguments about the nature of time and infinity. He uses these analogies, to make his point. Like, imagine you have a line of soldiers stretching back infinitely, one behind the other. How could you ever give an order to the first soldier?
There wouldn't be a first soldier.
Exactly. It's mind-boggling. Al-Ghazali's point is, you can't have an actual infinity when it comes to events. There has to be a starting point. And for the universe, that starting point is creation by God.
It's like that first domino that sets everything in motion.
Perfect analogy.
Okay.
So, yeah, Al-Ghazali uses reason to challenge the idea of an eternal universe. Now, let's move on to a second critique, the one about God's knowledge.
This is where it gets a bit tricky, right? Because some philosophers were saying that maybe God's knowledge is limited. Like, he knows the big stuff, the universal principles, but not every tiny detail.
Right, not every little thing that happens. They argued that getting caught up in those specifics, it would somehow diminish God's grandeur.
So God knows the laws of physics, but maybe not what I'm thinking right now.
Exactly. The idea was God operates at a higher level, not concerned with the minutiae of daily life. But for Al-Ghazali, this was way off base. It went against the whole concept of God's omniscience, which is central to Islamic theology. The Quran is full of verses that say God knows everything.
So for Al-Ghazali, even my most random, fleeting thoughts, they're all on God's radar.
Let's just say he believed in a God who is intimately involved in his creation, aware of every little detail. And that has implications for how we think about things like free will, destiny, all of that.
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. But for now, let's stick to the main points of his critique. So the third one, the question of bodily resurrection. Remind me what the philosophers were arguing there.
All right, so remember Plato, that idea that the soul is immortal, the body is just temporary.
Like shedding an old coat.
Yeah, and some philosophers took this concept and applied it to resurrection. They said it's more of a symbolic thing. The soul lives on, but not necessarily the physical body.
It's more about the soul's journey after death, not the body coming back to life.
Right, but in Islam, bodily resurrection is a fundamental belief. It's not optional. It's central to the whole idea of the afterlife and judgment.
So on the day of judgment, we're resurrected not just in spirit, but physically too. And all our actions in this life, they determine our ultimate fate.
Exactly. And Al-Ghazali felt that the philosophers, with their symbolic interpretation, they were missing the point. It undermined the whole idea of divine justice and accountability.
Like if there's no physical resurrection, how can we be held responsible for what we do in this life?
It just wouldn't have the same weight, the same consequences. And for Al-Ghazali, that was a dangerous thing. It could lead people astray.
So to sum up, we've got these three big areas where Al-Ghazali clashes with the philosophers: the eternity of the world, God's knowledge, and bodily resurrection.
He sees them all as problematic, not just from an Islamic perspective, but philosophically too. And what's fascinating is he doesn't just reject these ideas outright. He uses reason and logic to dismantle their arguments.
He's like, all right, let's play your game, but let's play it right.
And he was brilliant at it. He would point out contradictions in their own thinking, expose hidden assumptions, really pick their arguments apart.
So walk me through some of his tactics. How did he take down these philosophical giants?
Well, one thing he did was highlight inconsistencies. He'd take their premises and show how they led to conclusions that just didn't square with other things they believed.
So he'd be like, hey, you say this over here, but then over there you say something totally different. Which one is it?
Exactly. He was a master of exposing those logical inconsistencies. He also challenged their reliance on pure reason, saying, look, some truths, especially about the divine, you can't just figure them out through logic alone.
You need something more: faith, intuition, direct experience.
Right. And that brings us to another key point. Al-Ghazali wasn't just interested in pointing out flaws in their arguments. He was also worried about the consequences of these ideas. He felt they were dangerous.
We touched on that earlier. What did he mean by dangerous? Like, what was the risk?
He believed that these philosophical interpretations, while intellectually stimulating, could ultimately lead people away from the true path of Islam. And this was a time, remember, when people were very serious about their faith. Eternal salvation was at stake.
So the stakes were high. It makes you wonder how those philosophers responded. Did they just ignore him, or did they engage in the debate?
Oh, they definitely engaged. Al-Ghazali's work, it ignited this huge debate throughout the Islamic world. Thinkers rushed to defend the role of philosophy and reason.
So it wasn't just a one-sided attack. There was back and forth, a real exchange of ideas.
Absolutely. A clash of titans. And here's where it gets even more interesting. About a century after Al-Ghazali, another towering figure comes on the scene, Ibn Rushd, also known as Averroes in the West. He was a huge critic of Al-Ghazali. He wrote this whole rebuttal titled The Incoherence of the Incoherence.
No, that's a fighting title.
He isn't messing around. Ibn Rushd was all about defending the role of reason in understanding theology. He argued that philosophy, far from undermining faith, could actually strengthen it.
So it was this tug of war between those who emphasized faith and those who championed reason.
And that debate, sparked by Al-Ghazali, had a lasting impact on Islamic thought. It forced thinkers on both sides to refine their arguments, to delve deeper into the relationship between faith and reason.
It's amazing how a book written over 900 years ago can still be relevant today.
It really is. It speaks to the power of these timeless questions. We're still wrestling with them today. The limits of reason, the role of faith, the nature of truth.
So we've covered Al-Ghazali's critiques, his methods, the impact of his work. But there's another layer to this, right? Something more personal.
You got it. We've talked about his intellectual journey, his arguments with the philosophers. But to fully appreciate him, we need to understand that personal transformation he went through, that spiritual seeking. That's where the mystical side of his thinking comes in.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about this mystical side of Al-Ghazali.
All right, so picture this. Al-Ghazali, he's at the top of his game intellectually. But he's struggling with these deep doubts, these existential questions. He's a master of logic and reason, but he's realizing that those tools alone, they're not enough.
It's like he hit a wall. Intellect could only take him so far.
Precisely. And that's when he makes this radical decision to step away from it all. His position, his comfortable life, everything. He goes on this journey of spiritual exploration.
So he goes from star scholar to wandering seeker.
It's a huge shift. And it was during this time that he really gets into Sufi practices, exploring this inner dimension of Islam. Sufism, it's all about a direct experiential connection with the divine.
Not just reading about God, but actually experiencing God.
That's the heart of it. And this is where Al-Ghazali has this breakthrough. He realizes that true knowledge, it's not just about concepts in your head, it's about a transformation of the heart, a direct apprehension of the divine.
So it's like he went from being a brilliant mind to a transformed soul.
And that experience, it completely changed how he approached his work. When he came back to writing and teaching, it was from this totally different place. He was no longer just a scholar, he was a witness.
Someone who had seen something, experienced something beyond the realm of logic and reason.
Exactly. And that's what gives his work such power. He's not just arguing, he's sharing what he's seen, what he's lived.
Okay, so we've got this fascinating backdrop of his personal transformation, his mystical experiences, his connection with Sufism. But how does all of that tie back into his critique of the philosophers?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. But I'll leave you with this thought. Al-Ghazali's critique wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was a passionate defense of a worldview that was shaped by his own profound spiritual experiences.
All right, so that's where we'll leave it for part 2. We've explored Al-Ghazali's critiques of the philosophers, his methods, and the impact of his work. We've also touched on his personal journey, his embrace of Sufism, and that mystical element in his thought.
And in part 3, we'll dive into the implications of his work for us today. How do his ideas challenge us to think differently about faith and reason, about the limits of knowledge, and about the search for truth in our modern world?
So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive. We'll wrestle with some big questions, grapple with the legacy of Al-Ghazali's thought, and maybe even come away with some insights for our own lives. All right, welcome back to our exploration of Al-Ghazali. We've journeyed through his critiques, his personal transformation, gotten a glimpse into that mystical side of his thinking.
And now in this last part, we get to the heart of it. What makes Al-Ghazali so relevant today, centuries after he was writing? What can we learn from him in a world that's, well, completely different from 11th century Baghdad?
It's a good question. I mean, we've got science, technology, globalization. It's a whole different ballgame.
It seems that way, right, on the surface. But if we look a bit deeper, I think those core questions he wrestled with, they're still there. In some ways, his message might even be more crucial now than it was back then.
Okay, unpack that a bit. How does an 11th century theologian speak to the challenges of the 21st century?
Think about it. We're bombarded with information, data, scientific breakthroughs all the time. It's easy to fall into this trap of thinking we can explain everything through logic and reason.
Like science has all the answers.
Right. And don't get me wrong, science is amazing. It's given us so much. But Al-Ghazali, he reminds us that reason has limits.
Like it can tell us how to build a rocket, But it can't tell us why we should go to the moon.
Exactly. Those big why questions, the existential stuff, science can't fully answer those. And that's where Al-Ghazali comes in. He's like, hey, there are other ways of knowing, other paths to truth.
Paths that involve faith, intuition, those things we can't always measure or explain.
Precisely. He's not saying we should ditch reason altogether, but he's urging us to be open to the idea that some truths, they lie beyond the reach of pure logic.
You know, I think in some ways our modern world, it's become even more focused on the material, the measurable. Algorithms, metrics, data points for everything. We've almost lost that sense of wonder, of mystery.
Yeah. And that's why Al-Ghazali is so timely. He's like a wake-up call, reminding us there's more to life than what we can see and touch, quantify and analyze. There's a whole spiritual dimension and inner world that we often neglect.
It's not just about knowing more stuff. It's about a deeper kind of understanding of ourselves, our place in the universe, maybe even our connection to something bigger.
Right. It's about meaning, purpose, those things that science can't always measure in a lab. But okay, it's easy to say, be open to other ways of knowing, but how do we actually do that, especially in a world that's so obsessed with logic and rationality?
It's a tough one.
It is. And Al-Ghazali, he doesn't give us easy answers. But one thing we can take from him is the importance of intellectual humility.
That idea of recognizing the limits of our own knowledge. It's a hard pill to swallow sometimes, especially in this age of social media where everyone's an expert on everything.
Right. Everyone's got an opinion, and they're sure they're right. But Al-Ghazali, he reminds us that true knowledge starts with recognizing how much we don't know.
Being open to the possibility that we might be wrong, that there might be other ways of looking at things.
Exactly. And this humility, it's not about being wishy-washy. It's about being intellectually honest, acknowledging our own limited perspective, being willing to listen to other viewpoints.
You know, I think that's incredibly relevant to what's going on in the world today.
Yeah.
All this polarization, division, the inability to have a conversation with someone who sees things differently.
It's like we've forgotten how to disagree respectfully, to listen with empathy, to find common ground.
And Al-Ghazali, even though he was a fierce defender of his own beliefs, he seems to be advocating for a more nuanced approach.
Absolutely. One that recognizes the complexity of truth, that's open to dialogue and debate.
It's like he's saying, hey, we're all in this together, trying to figure things out. We can learn from each other, even when we disagree.
And that's such a powerful message, especially today. It reminds us that intellectual humility, it's not weakness, it's a strength.
It allows us to be curious, open to new ideas, maybe even surprised by what we discover along the way.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Al-Ghazali, it's like he's left us with this challenge to step outside our comfort zones, question our assumptions, embrace the mystery.
To remember that the search for truth, it's not a solo mission. It's something we do together.
And the more open we are to different ways of knowing, the richer our lives will be. So thanks for joining us on this exploration of Al-Ghazali. We hope it sparked something in you, maybe even inspired you to continue the journey.
Keep those big questions alive. And who knows, maybe we'll tackle another philosophical heavyweight in our next deep dive.